Good afternoon. Good afternoon. Thank you. All right. So my name is John Whalen. Some of you have had my classes, but a lot of you are new to me. So I'm an instructor here at UCCS. I was an FBI agent for 26 years. One day, not that long ago in my mind at least, a long time ago in your minds, I was sitting in a room like this, getting my bachelor's degree, and never thought that I could ever become an FBI agent. So I went to a school called the University of Nebraska at Omaha. It's very similar to UCCS. It was a state school. At that time they had no dormitories. Nobody lived on campus. It was a commuter campus, so we came in, went to class, and went home, went to work, whatever. It is possible. Your dreams can come true. You got to have a plan, and you got to work at it. But you can achieve. Okay. The FBI hires people from all types of diverse backgrounds, so not like the CIA so much, where the CIA does more Harvard, Yale, Princeton, those types of people. The FBI is not like that. So if you have a dream of becoming whatever it is, and work towards it, but have a plan, and then have a backup plan. So I had a backup plan if the FBI didn't work out for me. So after the presentation's over, during question and answer, if you have any questions about the FBI or becoming an FBI agent, I'll be happy to entertain those. But today we're talking about suicide terrorism, suicide bombers, what their motives and all this type of stuff is. I first started working terrorism investigations as a first office agent in Buffalo, New York. And it was about 1986, and the supervisor came up and says, I want you on my squad. So the next thing I know, he hands me some files, and I was assigned to seek terrorism investigations. I don't know what seek. I didn't know what seek was, much less that they were involved in terrorism. So, it was way before 9/11, way before terrorism really became a high priority for the FBI. But that's just the way it is. You got assigned to it, so I started studying up on Sikhs and who were they and where are they from. Most of the Sikh terrorism was actually occurring in Canada, in and around the Toronto area. But they were crossing from Canada, once the Canadians started investigating them, they were crossing into the United States over the Rainbow Bridge in Niagara Falls, New York, and then making their way into the Sikh community in Buffalo. So that's how I got involved in terrorism investigations. So it's kind of weird, right, how these things happen. Throughout my bureau career, I've served in a variety of assignments. A lot of them were either counterintelligence or counterterrorism related, so that was pretty much my specialty. I've been in Afghanistan. I've served in the Middle East. I have served in Romania, Germany. So a lot of different opportunities, and most of them, again, were counterintelligence, counterterrorism related. One of my last assignments, I was the FBI liaison officer to the CENTCOM General Staff at MacDill Air Force Base in Florida. What that means is that the FBI was heavily involved and invested in Afghanistan and Iraq. We had FBI agents on the ground within the first 72 hours of combat operations. What we did was sensitive site exploitations. We also had a lot of FBI bomb technicians that were working hand in hand with the military because of the large number of suicide bombings, truck and car bombings, etc., trying to figure out who made the bomb, how was it delivered, how was it detonated, etc. So that was under some pretty high-risk situations. And why is this prevalent? Why do we even care about suicide bombing? How often has that happened in the United States? Can anybody think of a recent situation in the United States that involved a suicide bomber? Within the last 20 years even? 9/11. Those people were suicide bombers, right? They used aircraft and they plowed the aircrafts into buildings and committed suicide in the process. So it's not always a car bomb or a vest. It can be use of other vehicles and stuff. There's a lot of speculation within the FBI and the intelligence community that of the 15 hijackers that were on those 4 aircraft, most of them did not realize themselves that it was going to be a suicide effort. They really thought they were going to go up, hijack a plane, fly to some destination, and then make demands in order to get the plane to be released to them. They didn't realize it was going to be a one-way trip. only a couple people on each aircraft actually realize that. So that's a speculation. There's some, we don't know that for sure, but that's certainly what there are indicators of. So why do people do something like that? To strap a bomb to your body, or to get in a vehicle laden with explosives and drive yourself up to a destination and then kill yourself in the process of trying to kill as many other people, human beings, as possible? What drives that? Are they crazy? Ideology, right? Religion. Well, first, we have to talk about what's the definition of terrorism. If somebody walks into a movie theater in Aurora, Colorado, and opens fire at unsuspecting people, is that an act of terrorism? Yes. If two knuckleheads decide to go into Columbine High School and carry explosives and firearms and begin shooting teachers and students, is that an act of terrorism? A lot of people believe, we hear this terrorism, but in reality, the definition of terrorism all revolves around motive. Why did they do what they did? So if somebody goes into a movie theater and just starts shooting indiscriminately, or they walk into a nightclub in Florida and open fire on all the people in the nightclub simply because they don't agree with their lifestyle choices, that's not terrorism. It's a terror tactic, but it's not terrorism. Terrorism is driven by political motivations. There's a political aspect to it. And that's why when you start looking at suicide bombings in context of terrorism, all of a sudden it starts to make sense. They're not a bunch of lunatics that are just out doing things randomly. Even the 9/11 bombers selected their targets based on ideology. Twin Towers represents what? Our economic power. The Pentagon, our military power. The fourth plane that crashed into a field in Pennsylvania, their target was either the Capitol building or the White House, which is symbolic of our political power. Those targets were all selected because of their symbolic power. The idea that we can attack the United States militarily, politically, and economically. That's what suicide bombing, that's what terrorism is all about. So when people want to introduce legislation in the Colorado legislature, for example, and say that all school shootings should be labeled as domestic terrorism, that's not really what the whole purpose of domestic terrorism is about. When Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols drive a truckload of explosives and park it outside the front of a federal building, light the fuse or hit the timer and walk away blowing the face off of a federal building because they were mad at the United States government for what had happened the previous year in Waco, Texas, that's domestic terrorism. They were sending a clear message to the United States government that you got to lay off on this. You got to give people their rights. So there was a political motivation for that. That is different than somebody like the shooter in the Aurora movie theater. He's not acting out of any political motivations. He might not even be able to articulate himself why he did what he did. Or the same thing with the nightclub. That might be a hate crime, and it might be a tactic that caused the people in the nightclub to feel terror, but it's not terrorism within the definition that we're looking for. It's political motivation. They're doing it because they have a cause. And they're doing it because in that cause, they're not capable of going toe-to-toe with the United States military. Do you think that if all the Taliban in Afghanistan all congregated together at one time and made a mass attack against United States military formations, how long do you think that battle would actually last? Minutes? Right? We would obliterate them. They can't go with us toe-to-toe, soldier-to-soldier, tank-to-tank, airplane-to-airplane. They have to use other tactics and techniques to achieve their political objectives without trying to do it on the battlefield. So that's what we're here to talk about today, is suicide bombing as a technique used by terrorist organizations for political objectives. And like I said, when you start putting it in that context, all of a sudden it starts to make sense. They're not lunatics. There's a method to the madness. So what are the perceptions? What's the reality? What is suicide terror? Who does it? Why do they do it? What are the numbers, the trends? Who gets targeted? That's what we're going to be talking about over the next 60, 70 minutes. What are the perceptions? Well, when suicide terror, when suicide bombings first became prevalent, really around 1983 is where in modern history suicide bombings became prevalent. And that was when Hezbollah, which is an Islamic extremist organization that is headquartered in southern Lebanon and supported by the country of Iran, when Hezbollah, the United States Marines went into Lebanon, there was a civil war, primarily between Islamics, Muslims, and the Christian government at that time of Lebanon. A civil war erupted. The United States sent in Marines, as did the French, sent their armed forces, and we tried to go in to stabilize Lebanon, to separate the two factions, and hopefully end up with some sort of political resolution to the dispute. Hezbollah didn't want the United States Marines there. They didn't want the French there. They wanted to take control of the government, and they wanted to call the shots in Lebanon. But again, Hezbollah, as well trained as they were, and they are very well trained, they could not go toe-to-toe with the United States military or the French military. So how do we get them out of there? So what they did is they resorted to a series of car and truck bombings focused against the United States Embassy in Beirut, Lebanon, the United States Marine Barracks in Lebanon, and the French military barracks in Lebanon. Almost near simultaneous suicide bombings against all three locations that resulted in hundreds of casualties to the United States, to the French, and to our embassy personnel. That was the purpose, and that was really kind of the start of what we look at today as suicide bombers. But then slowly after that, we saw how successful it was, right? They decided, hey, this technique is a good technique, we're going to use it. And you started to see individual suicide bombers. Not always in a vehicle or a truck, but an individual with a suicide vest, laden with explosives, and they would walk up into a room like this, where a large group of students are. A bomb inside this enclosed area would be devastating. It would be devastating, not only to the people in this room, but think of the devastation and the fear that would be created on this campus. Is it going to happen again? When is it going to happen? How is it going to happen? Am I safe to go to school anymore? Maybe I should transfer to someplace else, right? So that those types of so we looked at this and we started to try to come up with a profile, right? Cops love profiles, and not all profiles are illegal, by the way. Okay, racial profiling is illegal, but a profile, a criminal profile, some of you want to be profilers, right? A criminal profile. So if we can figure out who it is or what the profile is of a suicide bomber and identify that, then we can use that information and give that to our security personnel, and then maybe we can figure this out ahead of time and stop the bombing. So they came up as young, single, male, uneducated, religious fanatics. That's what they came up with. That's the profile of a serial bomb, of a suicide bomber. In reality, that's completely wrong. There is no profile. Suicide bombers come in all shapes and sizes. Male, female, children, well-educated, poorly educated. The Saudis, and 13 of the 15 9/11 bombers were from Saudi Arabia, they were well-educated and came from upper-middle-class families. You would think that, well, those people have a lot to live for. Why would they do that? No, I could understand if maybe it was somebody that was really young and naive and impressionable, not well-educated, right? Some sort of fanatic, religious fanatic. Okay, I can, but that's not the profile. There is no profile of a suicide bomber to this day. What they do and what the Israelis do is they profile based on activities, based on how they act and interact within a crowd. And they become very, very adept at seeing a crowd of people coming towards, and I say a crowd, a lot of people, I don't mean that in a negative way, but they cross into Israel through checkpoints to go to work that day, and it'd be like coming across the U.S. border. You come across from Mexico, you have a job in the United States, and then you go home that night back to your family in Mexico. Same thing in Israel. But they become very adept based on their profile, which is not based on age or sex or anything, but based on how do they move throughout the crowd and what's suspicious, and they can pick those people out pretty frequently. So we've learned a lot, and the thing that we've learned most always is that there is no single profile that's going to be workable. In countries like, for example, when I was in Afghanistan, bombings were almost a daily occurrence. Some of them were vehicle bombs, which were not necessarily suicide bombers, right? They just set it in the vehicle and leave. That's not a suicide bomber. Or they could literally drive the vehicle up to a U.S. military checkpoint and detonate the vehicle then, and in which case then that's a suicide bombing, right? But in Afghanistan, the women dressed from head to toe, they were completely covered in their burqas, completely covered. And they had an eye slot, but even the eye slot you couldn't really see because they put like a real sheer, like a sheer that you put like in draperies, right? You put shears up on a drapery, and they could see through it, not real clearly, but you couldn't see in very well. So they started to realize that they were looking for, young males, etc. But then they started dressing up in burqas. Well, then you don't have any idea who is that person. Is it a male? Is it a female? Is it a child? Based on height, even that's just a guess, right? Short a child, tall. Well, there's short adults out there too, right? So it became very difficult to differentiate. So again, we had to move away from this idea that there's this profile. If we just identify this person based on these characteristics, that will identify them. It didn't work. It didn't work. We had to go more based, like the Israelis, based on behavior. So what is suicide terror? It's a punishment strategy. It does two things. It inflicts damage against society. It inflicts damages against the society. And it sends a powerful message to that society that your government cannot protect you. We can strike anywhere, anytime, and nobody's safe. So, when they first start striking, what's the government's response to a suicide bomb? What would they do? What do we do in our own airports now? Prior to 9/11, you didn't have to go through all these checkpoints. You didn't have to take your shoes off, your belt off, and you didn't have to do any of that stuff. All that's after 9/11. So what does the government do when this type of attack occurs? They take counteractions, right? And they try to identify, well, who's responsible? Oh, it's those people, whether they be Islamic extremists or whatever they think they are, and they start cracking down on them. They start doing mass arrests. They start beefing up security. You start stopping and searching people. You bring the military in. After 9/11, I was at FBI headquarters when 9/11 occurred in Washington, D.C. You out here in Colorado have no idea, really, if you were even alive back then, or even your parents, right, have no idea what 9/11 was really like compared to places like New York and Washington, D.C. that were actually hit by the targets, right? There are anti-aircraft missiles surrounding the Washington Monument the next day after 9/11. And that is a weird sight. Military with armored personnel vehicles, machine guns, anti-aircraft missile batteries. I mean, there was a strong reaction. Could you imagine if we did that day after day, year after year? It used to be that you could go to FBI headquarters and take a tour. After 9/11, no, we're shutting our buildings down, we're going to make them so secure. So that's what they want to do. They want to show a message to the people that the government cannot protect you. They want to force the government into way overreacting. And then the people get to start where they rebel too. Hey, you're violating our civil rights. I'm not even free to walk down the streets anymore. I can't get even into our own federal buildings anymore. I have to do all this stuff, right? And they start causing them to overreact, and that also turns the people against their government. Who does it? These are just some of the groups that are out there. Hamas, a Palestinian Islamic Jihad, other groups throughout the world, Al-Qaeda, Al-Qaeda, they're all, Hezbollah, I talked about Hezbollah in Lebanon, Chechen rebels, they actually target the Russians, and they actually bomb sent suicide bombers into the Russian ballet, and took hostages, wired up the building, and when the Russian special forces finally got done with negotiating and tried to take the building back, they detonated the bombs, and a huge loss of life. Almost all the terrorists were killed, but also a substantial proportion of the hostages were killed as well. A little heavy-handed in their tactics. Al-Qaeda, they were responsible for 9/11. Al-Qaeda, as we knew it then, doesn't really exist anymore. It went to the Islamic State, right? ISIL is what now? What does ISIS and ISIL, why are they against the United States? What do they want to do? Well, they want to actually establish a Muslim caliphate, an Islamic caliphate. In other words, we want to have it fall under Islamic law, and everybody that lives in our caliphate, you either obey Islam, or you get out, or we kill you, hunt you down and kill you. So they want to have their own. They don't want Western influence. They don't want democracy. They want to be able to call the shots and live life the way they want to. So how do they do that? Well, they got to get the United States and our military forces out of the Middle East, out of Southwest Asia, because that's what stands between us and them for the most part. There's ongoing civil wars in Syria. Lebanon to this day has never fully recovered from their civil war. Basically, Hezbollah owns all of southern Lebanon. Christian people and Christian forces can't go into those territories. So it's very unstable, and they want that instability because that's where terrorism thrives, is in an instability. People get sick and tired of it after a while, and they say to their government, just give them what they want. Just give them what they want. Maybe they'll leave us alone. Kurdistan, PKK, that's becoming a big issue right now because the Kurds right now are located in northern Iraq and also in places in Syria where they were allies with us in our battles against the Islamic extremists. Now the president has decided to withdraw U.S. troops from Syria, and now the Kurds are being targeted by the Turks. And people, well, why? The Kurds are not without blood on their hands. They have been waging a war against Iraq, against Turkey, against Syria, because they want to establish their own homeland, and they've been conducting suicide bombings and other types of attacks for decades against the Turks. Now the Turks are saying, hey, the United States isn't there anymore, it's payback time, we're going to go in and we're going to obliterate the Turkish revolutionaries and destroy their military capabilities. So again, the PKK and other Turkish organizations have been doing this for years. The Tamil Tigers, they were all against the government of India because Sri Lanka, the country that they lived, was off the coast of India. They wanted to be independent from the Indian government, kind of like Northern Ireland against the Republic of Ireland and the United Kingdom. They wanted to be part of the Republic of Ireland. They didn't want to be part of the UK anymore. They wanted to be independent, and they wanted the Catholics in Northern Ireland wanted to join the majority Catholics in Southern Ireland and reunite. So it's the same themes over and over and over again. It's just the geography that changes. So why do we use suicide terror? It seems like, again, it's an irrational act. Only a crazy person would kill themselves in that way. They've got to be crazy. Who would do such a thing? What it really is, it's well planned and it's logical. And they're designed to achieve specific political objectives. In 1983, the United States had a policy, and it still is to this day, we don't negotiate with terrorists. Hezbollah detonated their bombs, killed a bunch of Marines. President Ronald Reagan, who is not considered to be any kind of wimpy left-wing, whatever label you want to put on it, very pro-military, we brought the Soviet Union to its knees, right? Ronald Reagan, no, we're going to withdraw our people from Lebanon. We're going to get out of there because it's a civil war, and all we're going to do is get one of our people killed, and for what purpose? So their suicide bombings actually caused the United States military, the most powerful military in the world, to leave the region. They achieved their objectives. More recently, Spain is a member of NATO. Spain sent troops in support of NATO operations into Afghanistan. They were coming up on a presidential election in Spain, And there were Islamic extremists in Spain that wanted Spain to withdraw their troops and renege on their obligations under NATO as compared to Afghanistan. They then went to the main railway station in the capital city of Madrid and detonated suicide bombs at rush hour. 3 days later, the president of Spain, who had been leading in the elections up to that time, was soundly defeated. Shortly thereafter, Spain withdrew all their military support from Afghanistan and removed their forces from the area. So again, suicide bombing achieved a political objective. What's the trend? Well, prior to the early 1993, suicide bombings was almost unheard of on the entire planet. Now, during World War II, the Japanese were losing the war towards the end, right? They were running out of ships, they were running out of aircraft, etc. So what they did is they loaded up the few remaining aircraft that they had, loaded them full of explosives and enough fuel for a one-way trip, and they would literally crash their planes or attempt to crash their planes directly into U.S. warships. That was a type of suicide bombing, right? But it's not really politically motivated. It was an act of war. It was a wartime technique or tactic. But other than those types of isolated incidents, suicide bombing was not really heard of. But starting in 1983, when it worked and it achieved its objective, then you started to see increases. All the way up through the early 2000s, you can see how astronomically and unfortunately, it has only continued to accelerate since that time. If you see down here at the bottom of the screen, it's probably hard for you to read at the back of the room, but in 2016, we had the deadliest year on record for suicide bombings worldwide. 469 suicide bombings in 28 different countries that resulted in 5,653 deaths. Suicide bombings are going on all the time. Just because they're not directed against us doesn't mean that they're not happening. As a matter of fact, in the next chart, when you see what the casualty figures from terrorism in the year 2017, the United States, we're barely a blip on the radar. Barely a blip. Most of the terrorist attacks are going on Southwest Asia, the continent of Africa, really United States, Europe, other places. We get a lot of publicity and there are a lot of sensationalism, but in reality, we're not really the primary targets. Why do they do it? They do it because it works. They have territorial goals. They want to gain control of their perceived national homeland. They want to eject foreign military. What are they doing? What do they want us to do in Iraq? Get out. What do they want us to do in Afghanistan? Get out. And after they get us out of Afghanistan and Iraq, where else do they want to get us out of right now? What other country right now is almost totally dependent on U.S. forces to continue their current government? Kuwait, Saudi Arabia, U.S. military. Saudi Arabia has some military and they have some good equipment, but the Saudis couldn't stand up against the Iranians, although they are fighting kind of a proxy war in Yemen right now, and that really is a proxy war between the Iranians on one side and their allies, which are few, but still Iran is a powerful country, and the Sunni Arabs on the other. Kuwait, Bahrain, Saudi Arabia, and they're fighting a proxy war in Yemen to try to establish one side or the other to establish supremacy. And they are using suicide bombings and other tactics against each other. Osama bin Laden, who was in charge of Al-Qaeda and primarily responsible for the 9/11 attacks, he wanted the United States specifically, not only out of the Middle East, but specifically out of Saudi Arabia. Because bin Laden was a Saudi himself, came from a very wealthy and well-positioned family, but he said that the Saudi Arabian government is corrupt, that they are not focused on Islam and the fundamentals of Islam anymore, and they need to be overthrown. We need to get rid of the monarchy, and replace it with a religious-backed government, much like what Iran did after the Iranian Revolution. Who gets targeted? Democracies are the primary recipients, at least Western. When they're going to come after Western targets, they're going to come after democracies. They tried it in the Soviet Union or Russia, the current-day Russia. Like I said, the Chechen rebels. Do you think Putin cares whether 200, 300 civilians die? Is he going to give up territory or give up his hold on government because of casualties? Russia's not a true democracy. It's not a true democracy. So that's why it wasn't effective. All that Putin did was double down and sent even more forces into Chechnya and killed more Chechens. That's why after that kind of failed attempt, although it was spectacular and got a lot of publicity, the crackdown was so severe that they decided that maybe that tactic wasn't going to be very effective against the Russians, and they really haven't tried it that often again. But in Spain, against a democracy, why? The United States is a democracy. Why? Because if we can get the civilian populace to fear us more than they fear their own government, they'll vote them out of office, put other people into office that will be more amenable to what our demands are and our objectives are. And that's why it's successful against democracy. Could you be the president of the United States and say, "Oh, what the hell? 3,000, 4,000 people. It's nothing. You know, I'm not going to negotiate. I'm not going to do anything." No, it wouldn't work. The next election cycle, kick that person out, put somebody else in. So that's why primarily they like to go after democracies. Six of the 11 suicide bombing campaigns that occurred between 1983 and 2003, 6 out of the 11 achieved their political objectives. That's a pretty good success rate. The target states fully or partially withdrew from territory. They began negotiations and they released a terrorist leader or more. What are we doing in Afghanistan? We've agreed to start negotiations with the Taliban. So indirectly, are they achieving their political objectives? What's going to happen after the United States gets a treaty and, oh, the war's over, we won, we're leaving, and there's a treaty in place, and so everything is beautiful. Well, what happened in Vietnam? In 1973, we entered into negotiations with North Vietnam. 1973, we pulled out the rest of our combat troops, and by 1975, less than 2 years later, Saigon fell, South Vietnam was overrun, and to this day, there's one Vietnam with the government that won right after we left the war. What happened in Iraq after President Obama withdrew almost all of our forces? We had the rise of ISIS and ISIL. The caliphate was established. They ran huge territorial gains in Iraq and in Syria, and then we had to go back, resend more troops in there to try to bring more stability back. So again, if they can force us out of the territory, then they're going to achieve their objectives. And all they have to do is be more patient than we are. And we as a society, we don't have the patience anymore. We don't have the patience. In 1945, at the end of World War II, did we withdraw all of our troops from Europe? The answer is no. 70 years later, we're still sitting there, right? In Germany, in the UK, across Europe, and we kept the Russians from trying to invade Western Europe. In Korea, after the war ended, 60 years later, we're still in Korea. We're still in the Balkans 35 years after President Clinton sent troops in. If we withdrew from the Balkans, what would happen? It would go right back to the warfare that was going on before we went into stabilize it. So that's what they're trying to do. Be more patient than us. Try to keep hitting us where it hurts. Prove to the American people that we're vulnerable and they're not going to stop until they get what they want. And sooner or later we're going to say, who cares? It's just the Balkans. What's it got to do with us? We're spending too much time, too many lives for stuff that really doesn't matter to us, and we'll just leave. Democratic leaders publicly confirmed suicide attacks, pushed them to make concessions. Again, when we left Lebanon, here's a quote by President Reagan: "We couldn't stay there and run the risk of another suicide attack on the Marines." Ronald Reagan. So we pulled out. The Civil War, which was already bad, got much, much worse. Tens of thousands of people lost their lives. Hundreds of thousands of people were driven as refugees out of Lebanon. And to this day, although Lebanon is much more stable now than it was in the 1980s, to this day, though, Lebanon has never been. At one time, Lebanon, and particularly Beirut, was known as the Paris of the Middle East. It was a beautiful city, and people came from all over the world to travel to Beirut and to Lebanon as tourists, and that just doesn't happen that much anymore. It's still not near what it was as a result of the United States leaving. Why are they effective? Again, punishment strategy. So let's say we found out after 9/11, and let's say that 13 out of the 15 hijackers were Saudis. So do we blame the Saudi Arabians for 9/11? Let's say they were all Iranians, and let's say that we could prove that Iran was personally responsible for ordering attacks against the United States on 9/11. What could we have done? What could we have done to Iran to punish them for 9/11? Were we going to go over and drop nuclear weapons on them? Were we going to go in and make surgical strikes and blow up all their dams, all their bridges, all their power stations? Could we literally set them back 50, 60 years as far as their quality of life? But what would the reaction of the rest of the world be? Would it be favorable to the United States, or would they feel more favorable to Iran? Are we just going to line up B-52s, wingtip to wingtip, and carpet bomb Tehran? There was a lot of people that said, yeah, let's just bomb them into the Stone Age. How many other people that live in Iran aren't responsible for what their government does? They may not even believe in what their government does. We're going to kill all of them too, all the women, all the children, just kill everybody indiscriminately. That's the problem. Hezbollah, or these other groups, ISIS, ISIL, where's their headquarters at? Where are all the leaders at? Where are all their fighters located at? It's extremely difficult. They're dispersed. They hide among the civilian populations. We can't really locate them. And when we do try to, we try to do surgical strikes now with predators, right? The drones will launch missiles and try to take out individual targets. But even then, as good as our stuff is, do we make mistakes? We hit a wedding party. We hit a school instead of a terrorist target. It turns out that it's a busload of people coming back from some sort of field trip, and we thought it was a busload of terrorists, and it turns out they were all school kids. How much damage does that do to our status and our prestige and our credibility with the people of that country? How many innocent Afghanis have been killed by mistake or inadvertently by the U.S. military trying to protect themselves? So it makes it extremely difficult. We can't use air power. We can't use economic sanctions because they're not a government, right? So we can't identify them and their bank accounts. Why are they effective? Because the weaker people, the weaker side is able to compensate for their lack of military by using suicide bombings and suicide strategies. They can negate our power. We can't strike back. We can't figure out who they are. And so a little group of dedicated terrorists can literally bring an entire country to its knees. Almost everything we know about suicide terrorism from the very early days was wrong. There is no such thing as a profile. They aren't crazy. There is a method to the madness. It is a well thought out, well executed quasi-military campaign that more than half the time is successful in achieving their political objectives. It's cheap. There are studies that were conducted as to how much money did they spend on 9/11, the whole thing. There are some estimates that it was well below $50,000 that they actually spent selecting, recruiting the hijackers, training them, picking their targets, doing some test runs. What weapons did they use on 9/11? They used our airplanes as weapons, but how did they take over the airplanes? Did they have machine guns? Box cutters. You can go to Lowe's and buy a box cutter for like $3, right? They were able to cause billions of dollars worth of damage, kill thousands and thousands of people with box cutters, and a willingness to die for their cause. So it's cheap, it's effective, it's actually fairly easy to execute. So we need to use situational awareness versus profiling, study the tactics and devices being used in Iraq and Afghanistan. That's one of the primary reasons why the FBI has such high visibility in both of those areas, because we want to study, because once it comes into the United States, by statute, the FBI is the lead federal investigative agency for any acts of terrorism, either domestic or international. So we need to be over there. We need to figure out what they're doing, what their tactics and techniques are, because sooner or later, we're going to see that stuff in the United States. Boston Marathon bombing, right? How much did that cost? Pressure cookers, right? You're talking a few $100s. And look at the devastation that they can cause and the publicity that they can generate. We also need to interact with our corporate and private sector security partners, because the government can't do it all. How do they recruit so successfully? You look at pictures like this, and there's dozens, if not hundreds or thousands of them on the internet. Little children, right? She's got little sticks of pretend dynamite strapped. What is she, 5, 6 years old? If you're raised up in your educational systems, in your belief systems, that this is being a martyr is the ultimate. Also, some groups, some of the Palestinian groups on the West Bank and in other areas, actually pay the surviving relatives of suicide bombers $25,000. $25,000 to us, I don't think any of us would be motivated to commit suicide for $25,000. But $25,000 to a family that's living in a refugee camp in southern Jordan, $25,000 might as well be $25 million to them, right? And then the status and prestige. They literally have parades in their honor, and they have statues erected. And so they're like, oh boy, my child died as a suicide bomber. And much like we put stickers in our windows of families who have had family members become casualties in foreign wars, they do the same thing, and they feel the same way towards their children that commit suicide in furtherance of their objectives. It's a whole different way of looking at things than us. It's hard for us to understand. You've got to know your community. We have to recruit human sources. And that's also a bone of contention between the FBI and maybe the general public, right? What are you doing putting or recruiting sources from mosques? You're violating our religious freedom by having informants go to the ceremonies at our mosques. But if you don't have people, if Islamic extremism is the primary focus or the primary perpetrators of these types of attacks on this country, then you're going to have informants within the communities to figure out who the extremists are. Because in reality, the vast majority of people in the Islamic community themselves are not in favor of what's happening. So what we need to do is we need to recruit them so that they can be our eyes and ears. Somebody like me, I can't wander into that neighborhood and get people to trust me and tell me everything that's going on, right? So you have to recruit human sources. Devices are growing in sophistication. Have any of you heard of Richard Reed, the shoe bomber? Put a bomb in his shoe, He lights the fuse on an airplane, he's been trying to blow up the airplane, right? He's sitting there playing with matches, and the fuse won't light, and pretty soon all the people around him are like, whoa! And they literally jump on top of this guy and get him under control. So, and then there was, that was pretty stupid and pretty unsophisticated, right? But they're getting more and more sophisticated in their tactics and in their devices. It's not lone wolves. These people are not doing this on their own. As a matter of fact, the suicide bomber themselves is the least dangerous person in a perverse way. They're the least dangerous person in the whole organization because they're one and done, right? They're going to, after their attacks, they're dead. They're never going to do anything like that again. So what we need to do is not really concentrate so much on the individual bombers themselves, but try to figure out who are the networks, who's recruiting them, who's training them, who's supplying them with the explosives. Those are the dangerous people because they're going to keep doing it over and over and over again. So we need to figure out the networks, and we need to penetrate the networks and neutralize the networks in order to be successful. Officer response. What I want to talk about is deadly force when we talk about officer response. And even though like an active shooter scenario may be terrorism, more than likely not terrorism. If it's for a political agenda, then it becomes terrorism. Otherwise, it's just a murderous individual, right? But when we're talking about suicide bombers and they're using children and they're using women, right? What is our deadly force policy going to be? Let's say that, and there actually was a police officer in the parking lot of Columbine High School and actually watched the two students walk. They were carrying propane tanks that were wired up to explode. And a resource officer watches them go into the school. We had a mass shooting, an active shooter scenario at a shopping mall in Omaha, Nebraska. It was at a mall. It was between Thanksgiving and Christmas. The person had a rifle. He was wearing a long black jacket. He was carrying his rifle in the jacket. So what would be what's our deadly force policy if you see somebody and you think they might have a suicide vest underneath their clothing? Are you going to wait for them to get into the mall? Can you use deadly force? Would you be willing to shoot some 6 or 7-year-old kid that you think maybe strapped up, ready to commit suicide? Yes. What's our policy? We have to come to grips with this. We have problems right now in our own city about when should we use deadly force, under what circumstances should we use deadly force. But if we start getting to where we're subjected to random but regular suicide bombing attempts, we in law enforcement, we're the front lines. It's not the FBI. FBI will show up later and take charge and take credit for all the good stuff. But the first people that are going to be the first ones on the scene are going to be people just like you. You're the first, maybe you see them. What do you do if you see somebody that you think potentially has a bomb under their clothing? Are you just going to shoot them? And then what happens if it turns out that you were wrong? They didn't have a bomb under their clothing. But if you wait for them to go into the building and detonate, and you thought that you saw before, how many people had to die before? Well, why didn't you do? You see the dilemmas? We need to start thinking about this now. We need to start coming up with deadly force policies that are going to cover things like suicide bombers and train our officers to be situationally aware. But once you've identified one, what are we going to do? What is your immediate action drill to try to keep that person from going into their objective? A lot of suicide bombers that were directed specifically against the Israelis, right? They go in, they have a detonator, so they say, go over there and do this. Well, the Israelis started getting so good at being able to pick them out of the crowd that they would go up, they would be able to get them isolated, and then they would begin negotiations. Or if the person went ahead and detonated anyway, they would be out of the area and they wouldn't achieve their objective. The only person who would die would be the suicide bomber themselves. So they started saying, hey, what we need to do is we need to change our tactics. And a lot of times now, people with suicide vests on, they think they're actually controlling the bomb. They're really not. There's no backing out. Once we send you in, that bomb's going to go off. And so there are people there observing, right? And they're watching. And so if the person starts to show any indication to the observer that they're going to chicken out, or they're going to be intercepted before they reach their goal, we're going to remote detonate that thing right then and there and kill as many people as we can. Those are the types of tactics and mentalities that people are starting to do. What we're going to do is we're going to set one bomb off, and we're going to wait for all the first responders to come in, and then we're going to set off a series more and kill all the first responders. What kind of message would that send out if you did that 2 or 3 times successfully? That every time you sent people in to care for the wounded and the injured, they were then blown up themselves. Would that delay our response times and maybe say, hey, before we send our first responders in, we need to actually go in and clear the area first? How many more people are going to die waiting because nobody wants to go in and take the chance of having a secondary explosion, kill all the police officers and first responders? Those are the tactics and techniques that they're using and perfecting overseas right now. And they will use them against us under the right conditions. We have to start thinking about this now and can't wait for the bombs to go off and then start doing it on the fly. Just like Columbine. What was our tactics and techniques for active shooter scenarios prior to Columbine? Cordon off the area, bring our resources in, come up with a plan, and make a very measured response. How long does that take? Hours? You have hours when somebody's going in from room to room, shooting everybody in the building? So now what do? We now say, you go in. If there's one of you or two of you, you go in there and you try to neutralize the shooter first and foremost. That's your primary objective now. You don't wait for backup. You don't wait for the SWAT team to show up. It's your responsibility. You're on the scene, you need to go. And we saw the film down in Florida of the cop that was hiding outside behind a column while the shooting was still going on in the school. What was the reaction of the public to that person? Right? Hey, that's not what you're there for. Maybe you should be doing something other than police work if you're not willing to take that type of risk. So we need to start talking about this stuff now and have these types of conversations. We've been relatively secure since 9/11. We've had things like the Boston Marathon bombing. That wasn't a suicide bombing, by the way, because they didn't kill themselves. But still, we need to be having these discussions within law enforcement and come up with a plan. We need to look for the handlers. We need to be looking out for lookouts and surveillance. And we have to understand they have remote detonation capability, and there are also probably going to be secondary bombers. Okay, went through pretty fast, huh? We could go on for hours, but I'm not going to keep you here for hours. But are there any questions about suicide bombings, their tactics, their theories? Wow. Any questions about the FBI or a career in the FBI? I just don't care. Go ahead. Okay, so the question is, if I want a career in the FBI, what do I do now as a college student to get myself prepared? I get that questions or variations of that question all the time. Mr. Whalen, what should I study? I want to be an FBI agent. What should I major in? Should I be a CGA major? Should I become an accountant because they recruit accountants? Should I go to law school? Right? My answer to that is very simple. What you need to get your degree in is something that you have an interest in and an aptitude for, because that's what's going to make you be successful. The FBI will recruit successful people from all walks of life. Are there certain things or certain specialties that they're looking for? Yeah, if you become a computer whiz, especially in cybersecurity, they're looking for people like that. But if you don't have an aptitude for it, or you're really not interested in being a cyber forensic specialist, right? So your job is I seize a laptop, and then you go in and you do a forensic examination of a hard drive. That's a very important component of investigation. I would be bored senseless at sitting there all day after day after day going through file after file after file on the computer. That's not for me, that's not what I want to do, okay? But some people really love that kind of thing. So that's why I'm saying, go into something that you're interested in. If you have an aptitude for languages, that's a very highly sought after trait. But we're not talking French or Spanish or German or Italian. We're talking Chinese, Farsi, different dialects of Arabic, Pashto. So they're looking for the exotic languages, right? So that's not something that's actually very easy to learn in the school, not to the native speaking ability. So again, I wouldn't necessarily go in and get my degree in Arabic unless I really wanted to spend my life doing either working for the government or the FBI. And even then, that's not a guarantee that you're going to get into the FBI just because you speak Arabic or Farsi or whatever. So that's what you need to do. Come up with a plan. Most FBI agents, the average age of a brand new FBI agent is 32 years old. That's 10 years after the average person gets out of college. This is not their first career. You're not going to be recruited into the FBI as a special agent straight out of college. You could be recruited into the FBI as an intelligence analyst or other positions within the FBI right out of college, but not as a special agent. Not as a special agent. They want you to do something else. The military. There's a very high percentage of FBI special agents are former military. Much higher than the normal company, so to speak. But again, that was mine to help me get into the FBI. But don't run right out and join the Army or the Air Force because, that's going to get me in the FBI. There's no guarantee that that's going to happen. If you want to join the military because you think the military is a great career and you can learn a lot and everything, then do it. And then will that help you? Yeah, it'll probably help you. It won't hurt you unless you get kicked out or something. Right? But don't do something like that just because you think that's going to get you into the FBI. Because what if it doesn't work out? And then you got a degree that you're not interested in, or you spent years of your life in the military and it didn't get you what you wanted. So, does that make sense?
Yes.
Any other questions? Go ahead.
Would you say suicide bombers or terrorists, they adhere to like a certain label, like they really like the labeling theory or string theory, like they adhere to that stuff?
Okay, so there are some people that say that it's a learning theory, especially in countries where, again, they get money, there's all kinds of financial rewards, there's status and prestige, so those children are brought up in that environment and learn that it's a great thing to become a martyr for the cause. That is the epitome. That's the peak of my life if I can give my life for the cause. That would be a learning theory. But again, that doesn't apply to everybody, right? No one theory explains it all. Explains it all. What they do, though, is they do recruit people, and then they isolate them. So let's say that you show tendencies to me. I'm a recruiter, and I spot you, and I do an assessment of you, and I think based on what I know about you, you'd be a good candidate to become a suicide bomber for our organization. What we're going to do is we're going to get you, and then we're going to get you out of your family, away from your friends. We're going to isolate you. And the only people that you're going to interact in the weeks, maybe months of time that it takes to prepare, to get the bombs ready, select a target, all this stuff, you're only going to be dealing with us. And we get you in the proper frame of mind. So that way, we are assured, we're highly confident that when we turn you loose and we say, you go over there and do this, that's exactly what you're going to do. Because if you leave them in their family situation and they can socialize with their friends and stuff, maybe they start to think that, maybe this isn't such a good idea after all. Maybe I really don't want to do this after all. So they are very selective. And then once you've been selected, then they isolate you and indoctrinate you and then get you mentally prepared to go to follow through with the mission. I hope that answers your question. They come from all backgrounds. Again, 9/11, most of the bombers came from well-educated, wealthy families. You wouldn't think that would be their standard profile. In the 1970s, a lot of the terrorism that was going on, the Red Army Brigade, Baader-Meinhof gang, those were all upper middle-class kids that were being recruited into those terrorist organizations. So it just depends.
I was just going to say, it's almost like they're kind of like soldiers. You live in their individuality.
Exactly. Although much more extreme than
Yeah.
soldiers. Because, again, soldiers are taught to work as a team. It's not you, it's the team, right? But you're right, I mean, they indoctrinate them. And that's why, again, the internet is such a scary device, and we're seeing so many self-radicalized individuals. They go on the internet, they watch the films and the videos, and then they say, hey, you know what, I'm a true believer, and now I'm gonna go out. And sometimes even the person who went into the nightclub in Florida, he tried to claim at the end that he was doing this on behalf of ISIS. Was that really what his primary motivation was? Or were there other factors in his life that caused him to do it, and he just glommed onto that as maybe a rationalization or justification for what he's about to do? It's hard to say sometimes how true, because they're dead. Who is there to talk to or debrief, right? Yes, sir.
Do you think that the military is the best way to get recruited to the FBI? Is there like other ways?
No, like I said, the military, the Bureau does place a lot of stock in military background. Why? Because you learn leadership techniques, you learn how to work together as a team, achieve goals and objectives. So that type of background they find to be very compatible with the mission of the FBI. But at the same time, if everybody in the FBI was all ex-veterans and they don't think alike, they don't act alike, and the Bureau doesn't want that either. They want a diverse group of people that come from all different types of backgrounds. So what I say is, again, if the military is something that you're interested in because you think that you've got a future in the military, then, or you're doing it because I'm going to get all these benefits and I can finish my master's degree and let Uncle Sam, whatever the motivation is, I think that's great. And then later in your life, if you want to apply for the FBI, then that's wonderful and that would be beneficial to you, but it's not a guarantee. So don't just join the military. If I just serve 3 years of active duty, the FBI is going to recruit me. That's not necessarily true. Does that answer your question?
Do you think that there's like a specific branch or job?
Okay, again, if I were to give a suggestion to somebody for the military, what would be the best branch or job? Pilots, okay, primarily rotor, so helicopter pilots. The Bureau has a need for helicopter pilots. They have a need for people like airborne, ranger, special forces, right? There's a need for some of those guys too. But really, what they look for a lot is a military intelligence background. You handle classified information, you're able to analyze large amounts of data, be able to come up with a solution to a problem based on that. So military intelligence would be a good military background, because not only is the FBI looking for that, but so is Homeland Security, it's the Secret Service, and right on down the line. So that would be one career field specifically in the military that I think would lead to a lot of job opportunities on the back end would be military intelligence. Okay? Other questions? Go ahead.
Mr. Whalen, thank you for being here. My name's Ed. Question for you would be, you talked about political targets and how they're symbolic. Why would, say, Wall Street or the Treasury building not be considered one of those, or would it?
Well, Wall Street, actually, if you look at where the old Twin Towers are, they're only like a half mile up from Wall Street. So there's no gigantic buildings on Wall Street, but the Twin Towers is actually a symbol of our wealth and our ingenuity. So that's why they picked that as basically a symbolic target. Would a Treasury building, again, Timothy McVeigh and Terry Nichols, why a federal building? Because it was a symbolic target, it was a strike against the U.S. government. So that's why they do it, because it's symbolic, it gets maximum publicity, and if we can blow up a federal building, then we can sure as heck blow up your school or your, shopping mall or wherever. So if the government buildings aren't safe, then you guys sure as heck aren't safe. Does that make sense? Yes. Any other questions?